Picture this: a woman, alone at night, phone in hand, doing something she will never admit to her closest friend, something she was taught to feel ashamed of. Something millions of women do, and yet the world still pretends they don't. Tonight, we're going to look directly at what everyone looks away from. Because what's hidden in the dark rules us until we bring it into the light. Let me take you deeper into that first truth, because I think it's the one most people get wrong. When you see a woman reach for pornography, the automatic assumption is that she's chasing pleasure, that she's chasing an orgasm, a release, a physical sensation. And sure, on the surface, that's what it looks like. But if you actually sit with a woman and ask her what's happening underneath, if you go past the behavior and into the emotional architecture that built the behavior, you find something completely different. You find hunger, not sexual hunger, existential hunger. The hunger of a woman who has spent her entire life as an instrument for other people's needs. Think about how most women are raised. From the time they are little girls, they are taught explicitly and implicitly that their worth is measured by how well they take care of everyone else. Be agreeable, be accommodating. Notice what other people need before they even have to ask. Shrink your wants down so they don't inconvenience anyone. And by the time that little girl becomes a grown woman, she's become fluent in a language that has no words for what do I want. She can tell you what her partner wants, what her children want, what her boss wants, what her mother wants. Ask her what she wants and watch the silence that follows. That silence isn't emptiness, it's atrophy. It's a muscle that was never allowed to develop because using it was treated as selfish or unfeminine or dangerous. So now put that woman in front of a screen, alone, unobserved, unaccountable to anyone else's needs in that moment. And suddenly there's a space, maybe the only space in her entire day, where the question isn't, what does someone else need from me? The question, for once, is, what do I want to look at? What turns me on? What do I feel? And I want you to understand how radical that is for a woman who has organized her entire identity around the needs of others. It's not really about the content on the screen. The content is almost incidental. What she is actually doing, at the deepest level, is practicing the forbidden art of desiring something for no reason other than her own pleasure. This is why so many women feel confused and even disgusted with themselves afterward. Because there are two parts of her in conflict. There is the part of her that finally got to want something purely for herself, and there's the part of her that was trained since childhood to believe wanting things for herself makes her selfish, or bad, or too much. So the very act that gave her a moment of aliveness immediately gets punished internally with shame, and that shame doesn't teach her to stop wanting. It just teaches her to keep wanting in secret. This is the part I need you to really absorb. A starved person does not need to be shamed for eating. A starved person needs to be asked why they were starving in the first place. If a woman has quietly built an entire secret world where she finally gets to want something, that is not a character flaw you need to fix. That is a flashing red signal, pointing directly at every place in her life where she has been taught that her own desire doesn't matter. And until we're willing to look at that, until we stop treating the symptom as the crime, we will keep missing the actual wound entirely. Because a woman who has never been given permission to want anything for herself. Now let's go to the second truth, because this one lives even deeper in the body than the first. Every woman in this room, whether she realizes it or not, received a curriculum about her own sexuality before she ever had a single sexual experience. Nobody sat her down and formally taught it. It came through 1,000 small transmissions. The way her mother flinched when a sex scene came on television. The way her father's face changed when her body started to develop, as if it had suddenly become a problem to manage. The way she was told to cover up, sit properly, not draw attention. The way the word for a sexually confident woman was always said with a sneer, while the word for a sexually confident man was said with a kind of admiration. By the time she was a teenager, she didn't need anyone to say it out loud anymore. She already understood the rule. Your body is dangerous, your desire is dirty, and the good girls keep both of them locked away. Here's what almost nobody talks about. That message doesn't stay in the mind. It doesn't just sit there as a belief she can logically dismantle later in life. It drops down into the body and it lives in the tissue, in the breath, in the nervous system. It becomes a felt sense of danger anytime arousal starts to rise. So even a grown woman, decades later, financially independent, intellectually liberated, can find herself flooded with anxiety or self-disgust the moment her body does something as natural as respond to arousal, not because anything is wrong with her, because a much younger part of her is still bracing for the punishment that came whenever desire showed up before. This is where pornography becomes something far more complex than entertainment. For a lot of women, watching it in private, on her own terms, is one of the only ways she can approach her own arousal without an audience to perform for and without a partner whose reactions she has to manage. There's no one to disappoint, no one measuring her responsiveness, no one she needs to protect from her own pleasure. In that private space, her body gets to do the thing it was never allowed to do openly. It gets to just react, honestly, without narrative, without apology attached. And when you look at it that way, you start to see it less as indulgence and more as reclamation. It's the body quietly insisting, over and over, I am allowed to feel this. It's a woman, without even consciously framing it this way, negotiating with the old programming, testing whether arousal really is as dangerous as she was taught, finding out again and again in private that nothing bad actually happens, that the ceiling doesn't cave in, that she doesn't become a bad woman, that her body was never the problem. The shame that got attached to it was. This is why so many women describe a strange doubleness in these moments. Relief and guilt arriving at the exact same time, in the exact same breath. That doubleness is not confusion. It is two different timelines colliding, the woman she is now and the girl who was taught long ago that this feeling wasn't safe to have. And every time she survives that collision, without abandoning herself, something in her heals a little. Because a body that has been told for years to stay quiet will always, eventually, find a way to speak. Let's move into the third truth now, because this one is about something we don't like to admit we crave more than pleasure, and that thing is safety. Think about what real intimacy actually requires of a person. It requires you to be seen by someone who has the power to reject you. It requires you to want something from another human being who might not give it to you, or might give it and then take it away later. It requires trust, and trust, if you've ever been burned by it, is one of the most terrifying things a nervous system can be asked to do. Now think about how many women in this room have been let down in that exact place, betrayed by a partner they gave everything to, criticized for their body, their desire, their softness, their intensity, made to feel like too much or not enough in the same relationship, sometimes in the same conversation. Every one of those moments leaves a residue. And that residue doesn't just sit quietly in the past, it rewires what the body considers safe. So here's what happens. A woman who has been hurt in real intimacy still has the same nervous system craving for connection and arousal that every human being has. That need doesn't disappear just because it got wounded. But her body now has a very reasonable, very intelligent protective response. It says, I want this, but I don't trust a real person enough to get close to it again. And that is precisely the gap that a screen can fill, because a screen cannot reject you. It cannot compare you to someone else halfway through. It cannot get bored of you, criticize your body, or use what you shared against you later. In that fantasy space, she gets to have access to arousal, to want, to feeling turned on and alive, without having to hand her nervous system over to another unpredictable human being who might hurt her again. This is why I want you to stop thinking of this as a woman choosing fantasy over reality, because reality bores her. It's almost always the opposite. Reality doesn't bore her. Reality terrifies her at some unconscious level, because reality is the place where she has actually been hurt. Fantasy isn't a downgrade from intimacy. For many women, it's a workaround for a nervous system that hasn't yet learned that all hands are not the same hands that hurt it before. And here's the part that deserves real compassion instead of judgment. This isn't weakness. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do. It's supposed to protect you from repeating pain. The problem isn't that her body built a safer alternative. The problem is that nobody ever went back and helped her heal the original wound that made real intimacy feel unsafe in the first place. So she keeps living halfway, aroused but guarded, wanting but withholding the version of herself that could actually be hurt again. If you ever want to understand a woman's relationship with fantasy, don't ask what she's running to, ask what she's running from. Because underneath almost every retreat into a controlled, private, screen-based version of desire, there is an unhealed memory of a time when wanting someone real cost her far more than she was ever prepared to pay. Because the body will always choose the illusion of safety over the risk of being hurt again until the day it finally learns that not every hand will drop it. Now let's talk about the fourth truth, because this is the one that hides behind the most misleading disguise of all, the disguise of lust that is actually loneliness wearing a costume. I want you to think about how many women you know who look, from the outside, like they have full lives, a career, a social calendar, maybe a marriage, maybe children, maybe a group text that never stops buzzing. And yet, if you sat with them long enough, in the honest hours late at night when the performance drops, you would find an ache that has nothing to do with how busy or accompanied their life appears. That ache has a very specific shape. It's the ache of not being truly seen, not being touched with attention, not just contact. Not being chosen, actively and specifically, out of everyone else a person could choose. Here's what almost nobody says out loud. A woman can be married and still be starving. She can be surrounded by people every single day and still go to bed feeling completely invisible. Because closeness in proximity is not the same thing as closeness in attention. A partner can be lying right next to her, physically present, and still be 1,000 miles away, emotionally scrolling on his phone, checked out, going through the motions of a relationship without actually inhabiting it. And a woman's body knows the difference. It always knows the difference. You cannot fool a nervous system into feeling chosen just because someone is technically in the room. So what happens to that ache when it goes unmet for long enough? It doesn't just disappear because it's inconvenient. It looks for somewhere to go. And sometimes it disguises itself as desire, because desire is a more socially acceptable feeling to act on than grief. It is far less vulnerable to say, "I was turned on," than to say, "I have not felt truly wanted by another human being in longer than I can remember." So a woman finds herself reaching for a screen, and she may even believe in that moment that what she's chasing is arousal. But if you slow the moment down, if you actually ask her to sit with the feeling underneath the feeling, very often what surfaces is closer to sorrow than to lust. She is not just seeking a sensation. She is grieving an absence. This is why the fantasy so often isn't just physical. It comes with a whole emotional atmosphere attached. Being desired without hesitation. Being the center of someone's complete attention, even if only for a few minutes. Being wanted without having to ask, without having to perform, without having to shrink or manage herself to be worthy of it. That is not shallow. That is a woman's psyche building in the only way it currently knows how, a temporary experience of the very thing she is quietly starving for in her actual relationships. And this is exactly why shaming this behavior misses the point so completely. You cannot shame someone out of loneliness. Telling a woman she shouldn't be doing this does nothing to fill the specific, aching absence that sent her looking for relief in the first place. If anything, the shame just adds another layer of isolation on top of the one she already couldn't voice. Because loneliness will always find a disguise to wear, until the moment someone finally asks her the one question she has been waiting years to be asked: when is the last time you actually felt chosen? Let's move into the fifth truth now, because this one has almost nothing to do with sex at all, even though sex is the vehicle it travels in. I want you to think about what it actually feels like to be numb. Not sad, exactly. Not in crisis in any way that would show up on the outside, just flat, gray. Going through the motions of a day, waking up, working, responding to messages, making dinner, while feeling almost nothing underneath any of it. This is one of the most under-recognized epidemics of our time. So many people are functioning perfectly well on the surface, while quietly disconnected from their own aliveness underneath. And women, in particular, often become extremely skilled at performing engagement while feeling almost nothing internally, because performing is what they were trained to do from a very young age. Numbness like this doesn't usually happen overnight. It builds slowly, out of chronic stress, unprocessed grief, depression that never got named, or simply years of emotional suppression required to keep a life running smoothly for everyone else. And here's the important part. Human beings cannot tolerate numbness indefinitely. Feeling nothing is not actually peaceful. It is its own kind of suffering, quieter than pain, but in some ways more corrosive. Because at least pain tells you that you're still alive and there somewhere. Numbness tells you nothing. It just sits on you like fog. So the nervous system, being intelligent and self-preserving, starts looking for anything that can cut through the fog, anything that can generate a signal loud enough to prove to the body that it still exists. This is where a lot of behaviors that look self-destructive from the outside actually make complete sense from the inside, because sensation Any sensation starts to feel like evidence of life. And arousal is one of the most powerful, fastest-acting sensations the human body has access to. It floods the system. It demands presence. For a few minutes, a woman who has felt like a ghost in her own life gets to feel her heartbeat, her breath, her skin gets to feel located inside her own body again instead of floating somewhere above it. This is why, for some women, the pull toward pornography has almost nothing to do with wanting connection or even wanting pleasure in the way we normally think about it. It is closer to a survival mechanism. It's the psyche reaching for a defibrillator, a desperate, subconscious attempt to shock the system back into feeling something, anything, rather than continuing to live inside the gray. And this is exactly why judgment is such a profoundly useless response to this behavior. You do not fix numbness by shaming the exact thing a person's nervous system found to temporarily override it. If anything, the shame just adds one more heavy layer on top of a person who is already struggling to feel anything real underneath it all. What actually needs attention here isn't the coping mechanism. It's the underlying flatness. It's the unprocessed depression, the unspoken exhaustion, the years of emotional suppression that led to this numbness in the first place. Because a person who feels fully alive in the rest of her life rarely needs to fight her way back to sensation through a screen. Because when a soul goes quiet for long enough, the body will always find some way to scream that it is still here. And now we arrive at the sixth truth, the one sitting quietly underneath all the others. The one I think is actually the root system that every single branch we've talked about tonight grows out of. Because if you take the starvation and the shame trapped in the body and the fear of being hurt again and the loneliness and the numbness, if you trace every single one of those threads all the way back to where they began, they all lead to the exact same place. They all lead back to one unanswered question that almost every woman in this room has been carrying since she was a little girl, whether she has ever said it out loud or not. The question is simply this: am I allowed to want? Think about how early that question gets planted. It doesn't arrive in adulthood. It arrives in childhood, in 1,000 tiny moments that seem too small to matter at the time. It arrives when a little girl reaches for something and is told to wait, to share, to think of someone else first. It arrives when she is praised for being good, meaning quiet, meaning agreeable, meaning easy to manage. It arrives when her body starts to change and the adults around her respond not with guidance, but with anxiety, as if her body becoming a woman's body was a problem that needed to be controlled rather than a natural unfolding that needed to be honored. It arrives when she expresses a preference and is met with a sigh, or a joke, or a comment about how she's being difficult. None of these moments look like abuse. None of them would show up in a story about a hard childhood. But they accumulate, quietly, into an operating belief that runs underneath her entire life. What I want is not the priority. What I want might even be a problem. And once that belief takes root, it doesn't stay confined to small things like preferences about food or plans for the weekend. It expands to cover the biggest want a human being carries, the want to be desired, the want to feel pleasure, the want to take up space with her own longing without having to earn it or apologize for it first. So by the time she is an adult woman capable of consciously choosing anything she wants for herself, there is still a much younger part of her running the actual show from behind the scenes, and that younger part never got a clear answer to the one question she kept quietly asking her whole life. Am I allowed to want this? Is my body mine? Does my desire get to exist just because I have it, without needing to justify it to anyone? This is why I said earlier that this isn't really a conversation about pornography at all. Pornography is simply the surface. It's the visible symptom of something invisible happening much deeper down. Every time a woman turns to that private moment, in some way, she is still asking that same unanswered question from childhood. She is testing it again. She is putting her toe over the line that was drawn for her so long ago and seeing whether the world collapses this time. And most of the time, nothing collapses. Nothing bad happens. And that nothing is actually enormous, because it becomes one more small piece of evidence that maybe, just maybe, wanting something for herself does not make her selfish, dangerous, or bad. This is why shame is the worst possible response any of us could offer a woman in this position. Shame doesn't heal the original wound, it just repeats it. It says, once again, in a different voice, at a different age, exactly what she was told as a child, that her wanting is the problem. And a woman who has spent her whole life being told her desire is the problem will not stop wanting? She will simply learn to want in secret, in shame, disconnected from anyone who could actually help her feel less alone in it. Which means the very thing we're afraid of women hiding this part of themselves is only made worse by the judgment we aim at it. So what actually heals this? Not more rules, not more shame, not more silence. What heals this is precisely what none of these women received the first time around: permission. Real, unconditional permission to want, to feel arousal without it needing to mean something is wrong with her, to need connection without being called needy, to have a body that responds to pleasure without that response being treated as evidence against her character. Healing doesn't come from a woman finally suppressing her desire successfully. It comes from a woman finally being met with the answer she needed her entire life. Yes, you are allowed to want. Your body was always yours. Your desire was never the problem. Because underneath every single behavior we've talked about tonight, the starvation, the shame in the body, the fear of real intimacy, the loneliness, the numbness, there is one little girl in every woman, still waiting for someone to finally look her in the eyes and tell her the truth she was never given, that she was never too much, that her wanting was never wrong. And the moment she finally believes that, she doesn't need the secret anymore, because she has finally come home to herself. And so, if there is only one thing I want to leave with you tonight, let it be this: stop looking at the behavior and start looking at the woman underneath it. Every private moment we've talked about tonight, every screen, every secret, every quiet ache nobody was ever supposed to see, was never really about what it looked like on the surface. It was a woman's psyche, in its own imperfect language, trying to tell the truth about a wound that never had anywhere else to go. She was never broken. She was never bad. She was simply doing what any starving, silenced, unhealed part of a human being will always do, searching for a way back to herself, using whatever map she was handed. So, the next time judgment rises in you, toward her or toward yourself, I am asking you to pause and offer curiosity instead of condemnation. Ask what she was truly hungry for. Ask what she was never given permission to feel. Because the moment we stop shaming the symptom and start listening to the need underneath it, we do more than help one woman heal. We begin to rewrite what an entire generation of women believes about their own bodies, their own desire, and their own right to want, without fear and without apology.